George Takei. This is episode 38.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casto, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
Yes, it was. And this week we talk about one of the actors who made this show what it was. Of course, I'm talking about the indomitable George Takei. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. George was there from almost the beginning. And while he's not in every episode, you can't think of Star Trek without thinking about his character, Mr. Sulu.
I know he was only in 52 episodes, but it feels like he was in every one of them.
It sure does.
Well, let's tell listeners how they can reach us.
All righty. Just go to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70s Trek. And of course, while you're there, you can leave us a comment or a question. You can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com.
And you can find the show on iTunes. Just search for it in the podcast section. And when you leave us a rating or a review, it will help other people find the show. Kelly, can you imagine Star Trek without George Takei's Mr. Sulu?
Not at all.
Really hard to imagine, isn't it?
It sure is.
You know, Gene Roddenberry created a character that, along with Lieutenant Uhura, told the audience right away what kind of future this show was taking place in. You know, it was a positive one where all humans work together in peace. And that was a really cool idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And George played Sulu perfectly. He didn't add any ethnic overtones. In fact, if the brightness was turned down, you wouldn't know Sulu was Japanese. So
right.
I don't know. Why don't we start, just jump in and talk about George?
Well, you looked at him leading up to Star Trek, right? Why don't you go ahead?
Sure. So George Hosato Takei was born April 20th, 1937 in Los Angeles to Japanese-American parents, Fumiko Emily and Takuma Norman Takei. Now, I'll call her Emily, was born in Sacramento. George's father, Norman, was born in Japan. Now, George's father was a bit of an Anglophile. So when George is born, he's going to name him after King George VI.
Which a lot of immigrants were. You know, they moved to America and they wanted to assimilate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And King George, his coronation was shortly after George's birth.
Oh, so he was named after King George.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's cool.
Yes. So now, at age 5, World War II breaks out, and just like many other Japanese Americans, his family was uprooted and forced to live in Japanese internment camps. 150,000 Japanese Americans.
Right. It is a. Oh God, do we have to comment on this?
It's a
sad dark spot on American history. It's kind of understandable, and I even kind of went a little bit that when I say that, but it is kind of understandable given the period and given what had happened, with Pearl Harbor and everything.
Yeah, we'll just move on. Now after they were in the internment camps, they returned home basically after World War II, and George, going through high school, he's student body president. He's a member of Boy Scouts. So he was that all around American guy.
Isn't that interesting? An all American guy.
All American guy.
That's awesome.
Yes. After high school, he enrolls in University of California at Berkeley to study architecture. Now, things went a little different for him when his dad showed him an ad in a Japanese community paper looking for somebody to do a Japanese Japanese to English dub of the Japanese movie Rodan.
So he actually did the voice work? Did the dub work?
Yeah, he did the dub work. I think for 8 characters.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. It was funny because his dad showed him the paper. He says basically, "Hey, you're a ham. You can do this." So this is like
awesome.
1956. So this is his start into the career.
Wow. That's very cool. And it's a great movie, Rodan. Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah.
I haven't seen it. I'm just messing around. I've never seen it. I know of it, but I've never seen them
all. I loved monster movies.
I mean, isn't that connected with the world of Godzilla a little bit, Rodan, right? Isn't it sort of? That's what I thought.
It's all in that universe, so to speak.
And the giant robot comes in with Johnny Sacco at some point, and he with Ultraman, they take on Godzilla and Rodan and save the Earth. That's another show for another time.
That's another podcast.
That's right. It's when we do the Johnny Sacco's Flying Robot podcast coming soon.
Stay tuned. All right. So now, of course, now he's got the bug, right? And he changes his major and goes to UCLA to study theater arts. And before he really even gets started, an exec at or an agent, at MGM, who George Takei, got to know in the Rodan movie. He contacted him about another role in a Playhouse 90. Now, I've never seen any of these Playhouse 90s, but there's a bunch of different stories here.
Playhouse 90 think of it as it was an hour-long show with a different story every week, like a mini TV movie every week. And they would get different actors and different writers. It was a big deal in the 50s, Playhouse 90 was.
Yeah. He was in the episode Made in Japan. So that was kind of his first, on-screen type of or on TV role. Then as he spotted in at UCLA doing a theater production by another Warner Brother casting director. This led to his first film debut in Ice Palace. And this is 1960, and it starred Richard Burton.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah. So this just started snowballing, led him to other roles in Perry Mason, some show called, again, I haven't ever seen this. I guess they don't syndicate it. Hawaiian Eye.
I've heard of that. I think Roddenberry wrote episodes for Hawaiian Eye.
Yes. Now, it got to this interesting role in Twilight Zone. Now, this episode called The Encounter, it only aired once in 1964. It's a story of a Japanese trader in World War II. George also, while he's doing all these different acting roles in Perry Mason and, there's another one, another movie, A Majority of One with Alec Guinness. He the whole time was still going to school to get his master's in theater arts.
And he performed with Alec Guinness. Sir Alec Guinness.
Wow. Yes.
Legend. He's a legend.
Absolutely. Some other roles, he was in My Three Sons, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Death Valley Days, Mission Impossible, It Takes a Thief, which is, after Star Trek a little bit. He's also, some more movies. 1965, he was in Red Line. James Caan was in that. Walk, Don't Run with Cary Grant. And another one, which I'll get to in a minute. He was also in a theater production of Fly Blackbird. So he kept pretty busy there the early part of his career. Let's see. So we get to Gene. Gene was looking for a multiracial crew, so he cast George in the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before. And, there you go. Sulu remained a regular cast member for most of the series. Now, while he's doing Star Trek, and I don't know if you have this in your notes, Bob, but I'm just going to jump in. He had a little hiatus at the end of the first season. And we've talked about that in previous podcasts. But he went on to, during that hiatus, to work on the Green Berets with John Wayne.
I know, how cool.
That is.
That's very cool. And he played the role of Captain Nim, and a South Vietnamese soldier.
Special Force officer.
Special Forces officer. But yeah, that's so cool. I mean, again, that's one of those where, I don't know, as a kid, like in the early 70s, that was on, and I think my parents were watching it, and it was like, you want to watch TV? You're going to watch this with us. Oh, God, all right. And I'm watching it, and all of a sudden, oh, my God, that's Mr. Sulu. What's he doing in this movie?
See, I had the other way. I'd watch anything John Wayne. Didn't matter what it was. And it wasn't a Western. I'm like, John Wayne's in something that's not a Western?
Right.
And I'm watching it, oblivious of what's going to happen next. And wait, there's George Takei. I mean, there's Sulu. I didn't know him as George Takei then.
He's, and I'm going off on a tangent here, he is an actor who really sometimes gets a lot of crap for not having a big range. But if you don't think John Wayne can act, then I suggest you watch the movie The Searchers with another Star Trek alum. Do you remember who was in that movie? Jeffrey Hunter.
Yes.
And John Wayne gives a performance in the middle of that movie when the character is tired and emotionally spent that will shock and surprise you if you're paying attention. It is subtle, but it's emotional. And for anybody who's not a believer in John Wayne, you will be after you watch that scene. Very, very good. I was very happy to look into his post-Star Trek career. He worked quite a bit throughout the 70s. And as I go through this a little bit, I'm going to be mentioning some other actors because I began to get really tickled about all of the other co-stars he worked with, because these are names, I should say, that people will know. So let me dive in here. First of all, one of his first jobs after Star Trek was on The Courtship of Eddie's Father. And if you remember that show, it's the little boy and his dad, and we don't know what happened to the mom. And they had a housekeeper who was Japanese named Mrs. Livingston. And George Takei played her love interest in one episode called Gentleman Friend. And as a little kid, I remember that show. I love that show. Do you remember?
I love that show. Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
Do you remember Bill Bixby in that show?
Yeah. Bill Bixby is the reason I watched it. Love Bill Bixby.
Absolutely. Who would later go on to be the Incredible
Hulk. Yes.
His next job after that was in a show called Bracken's World, which there's not a lot of information on. It was a show about a fictitious Hollywood studio. Interestingly, though, in the episode that George was in, there was a guy by the name of Terry Carter who played, later on, Colonel Ty on Battlestar Galactica.
Oh.
Yeah, very cool. That was in 1969, too. In 1970, he played the part of Yamashita in a Jerry Lewis movie, Which Way to the Front. Yeah, go figure. He was in a Jerry Lewis movie. I'm sure the French people were very happy about that. Also that year, he guest starred on an episode of Marcus Welby. I watched Marcus Welby a lot with my parents when I was a kid. Now, this is kind of cool. In that episode was Larry Hagman, after he had played Major Tony Nelson in I Dream of Jeannie. And actress Barbara Anderson. Why is she notable? Star Trek fans will remember her because she played Lenore Caridian in the Trek episode, The Conscience of the King. Do you remember how I made fun of her when we kind of talked about it? Yeah, I know I shouldn't have done that. She's beautiful. In 1971, George went on to work in a TV movie, Josie's Castle, And that same year, he also guest starred on an episode of O'Hara, U.S. Treasury, starring David Jansen. Remember David Jansen?
Yes.
From The Fugitive as well?
Yep.
Now, in that episode, also guest starring with George was William Campbell. Remember William Campbell from The Squire of Gothos, where he played Squire Trelane, and The Trouble with Tribbles, where he played Captain Koloth.
Right.
Wow. So he's beginning to, bump into all kinds of little Star Trek alum. I said little. I don't know why I threw that in there. And, of course, if you're an actor in the 70s, you probably worked on Ironside with Raymond Burr. And George Takei did. What a classic show Ironside is. When you say it, everybody knows it. Everybody pictures Raymond Burr in the chair,
Yep.
So we had talked about Barbara Anderson a moment ago. Interestingly, she was on Ironside for 105 episodes, but left the season before. So she was not on the episode that George appeared in. But I just
almost
thought
a close encounter.
Almost another close encounter. I just thought I'd throw out that tie. In 72 and 73, George doesn't have any on-screen credits, but it's interesting because the reason for this is he briefly got involved with politics. In 1972, he was an alternate from California to the Democratic National Convention. And in 1973, he decided to run for a seat on the Los Angeles City Council.
Huh.
Now, he lost in the election, but he got 33% of the vote. And the guy who won, I think, got 42% of the vote. So it was close. It wasn't a blowout.
It was close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
During the election, this is very funny, TV station KNBC in Los Angeles stopped running Star Trek reruns. And they even changed the run order of episodes for Star Trek the Animated Series so that an episode with Takei didn't appear during the election. It's not that they were against George, but there used to be a rule called the equal time rule in broadcasting put out there by the FCC, and the station was trying to follow that rule. They felt that if George appeared during the election on Star Trek and the animated series, that the opponents would cry foul. And in fact, they did anyway. The other candidates complained that Takei had too much star power and that his powerful speaking voice was an unfair advantage.
Oh, gosh.
I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah.
So what did they do with Reagan?
Right. Who knows what exactly was being said at that time with Ronnie, right? In 73, the mayor of L.A. appointed George to the board of directors of the Southern California Rapid Transit District. Now, that's a big name for an organization that planned the Los Angeles subway system. So George Takei was on the team that did that. In fact, while shooting the motion picture later on, he was actually called away, had to leave the set to go cast a tie-breaking vote.
Jeez.
That ended up creating the system. So there you go. All right, now let's go back to 1973. George lent his vocal talents, that we all know this, to play Lieutenant Sulu again in Star Trek the Animated Series. Have to throw that out there.
Yes.
The following year, he guest starred on a favorite of mine, The $6 Million Man. He was in an episode of that show. In that episode, France Nunien, who played Elan in the Star Trek episode Elan of Troyes. Another Star Trek connection. They're everywhere.
They're everywhere.
In 1975, he was in another TV movie. This one was called Year of the Dragon. When I first saw the name, I'm thinking, oh my God, is this a Bruce Lee movie? And then I looked at it and no, it wasn't. It wasn't a martial arts movie. It was nothing like that. So we'll just move on now. That was followed by an episode of a TV show, you're going to love this, called Khan! I'm not kidding you. The name of the show was Khan! Exclamation point.
I saw that when I was researching.
The show was about a Chinese detective in San Francisco. Wow. Also in that episode were Vic Tayback. Remember Vic? From Alice?
Yes.
And a very young Scott Glenn. who would go on to do lots of TV and movies. One of my favorites, The Right Stuff.
Yes.
Yes. And, of course, George was he had to be, on an episode of Hawaii Five-0. Now, we all know the Star Trek connection there. The obvious one is that Jack Lord at one time was considered to play the part of Captain Kirk. But that's not really the strong Star Trek connection, because in the episode that George was in was also John Colicos, who we first got to know when he played Kor in the Star Trek episode Errand of Mercy. Another tie.
It's incredible.
It is incredible, isn't it? In 1975, George finished the year playing in an episode of Chico and the Man, which it really has nothing to do with where I'm going, except I just really wanted to say Chico and the Man.
And the Man.
So there you go. The following year, 1976, George guest starred on Ba Ba Black Sheep. Remember this show?
Oh, I love Ba Ba Black
About
Sheep.
the Marine squadron in World War II in the middle of the Pacific. Get a load of this cast on this show, though. This is incredible. Robert Conrad, right? Simon Oakland. Now, you might not immediately recognize the name, but Simon Oakland always played a tough police captain in a ton of cop shows in the 70s. When you see his face, if you go out to IMDb, you'll go, oh, yeah, I know that guy. Very, very big character actor. You'll know his face right away. Dana Elcar from MacGyver. Dirk Blocker, Dan Blocker's son from Bonanza. John Larroquette, who later went on to become a Klingon in Star Trek III.
Oh, my gosh.
Larry Minetti, who played Rick in Magnum P.I. And Jeff McKay, not as famous as some of these other guys, but Jeff, his face you'll recognize because he played a lot of recurring characters in shows like Simon and Simon or Tales of the Gold Monkey or Magnum P.I. He was in a lot of those kinds of shows, and if you go out and look at him, you'll immediately go, oh, yeah, I remember Corky now. Yeah. In 1977, George had a small role in a TV movie called Have I Got a Christmas for You? And it had a lot of big names in it, and I'm not even going to go down that list. But I've never heard of it before, so I imagine it was one of those TV Christmas specials.
Yes. Today, if it was on, it would be on the Hallmark Channel.
Yes, probably. I'm wondering if it wasn't like a variety show. Who knows?
Who knows?
Maybe George jumped on stage with a sword. Anyway, in 1979, George was in an episode of Vegas with Robert Urich. Remember Vegas? I loved that show when it was on. I watched it all the time.
Yeah, Who Else is in Vegas?
And who else is in Vegas?
Yes.
Greg Morris, who co-starred in Mission Impossible. Is that who you were thinking of?
Maybe not. But there's a connection with Mission Impossible.
That's funny. Also in 1979, George writes, or I should say he co-wrote, a sci-fi novel, Mirror Friend, Mirror Foe, with author Robert Asprin, which I never knew. I didn't know that.
No.
I had no idea. And, of course, finally, George wraps up the 70s, replaying his role, Mr. Sulu, once more in Star Trek The Motion Picture. Final thoughts, Kelly, for George Takei?
He has had a great career, and, we didn't get into after, the 70s, but, he's done quite a bit after that, and just, I don't know, just beloved person, I think, by everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Star Trek wouldn't be Star Trek without George Takei. Next week, we dive into the Gold Key Star Trek comics.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.